They abandoned her at the riverbank, while expecting until a lonely woodsman felt her scream. The riverbank was a desolate stretch of bone-white stones, a place that reeked of crushing solitude, raw grief, and the chilling indifference of the wild. Nash Redwood moved through it like a ghost, his hands checking traps with a methodical precision that kept the memories at bay. This grim ritual was his only church, a penance paid in silence. He'd fled the world of men, haunted by the ghosts of a wife and child he couldn't save from a fever that burned just as cold as this river water. Then a sound shattered his solitude. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or a coyote. It was human. A scream, not of fear, but of primal, gut-wrenching agony. A sound of life being torn into the world with violent force. This wasn't just some grub-line rider in trouble. This was the one sound he could not face again. What happens when a man who has lost everything is forced to run toward the very crisis that broke him? And can he save a new life without being destroyed by the ghosts of the ones he lost? The river was Nash's silent companion. It spoke a language of stones, worn smooth, and of time that had no memory, and for a man who had too many that was a comfort. He moved along its desolate banks, a ghost in the gray morning light, the cold seeping through the worn leather of his boots. Each step was a rhythm, each checked trap a bead on a rosary of forgetting. This was his penance, this crushing solitude. He had built a fortress of it, walling himself off from a world that breathed and wept, and reminded him of the silence his own small family had left behind. The silence of a fever passed of a cabin that had grown too large overnight. He knelt, his fingers calloused and sure, working the wire of a snare. Empty, like everything else. The sky was a sheet of pewter, unforgiving. The wind had the cold bite of coming snow. Then the first scream tore through the quiet. It wasn't the shriek of a hawk or the cry of a cornered rabbit. It was human. It was raw. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart, and it struck Nash with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his heart a dull, sleeping thing jolting against his ribs. He had run from this. He had crossed mountains and forded rivers to never hear a sound like this again. His first instinct was to flee, to melt back into the skeletal trees and let the river swallow the sound. But it came again, closer this time, sharp and desperate, followed by a low, guttural moan of such profound agony it seemed to make the very stones vibrate. It was the sound of life and death wrestling in the mud, and something inside him, something he thought long dead, refused to let him turn away. He moved his long strides, eating up the distance, the leather of his hunting pack groaning with each step. He rounded a bend choked with willows and saw her. She was half in the frigid water, clinging to a large moss-slicked rock, as another wave of pain seized her. Her dress, a simple calico, was soaked and plastered to a body impossibly, undeniably round with child. Her face pale as birch bark was beaded with sweat despite the cold, her knuckles white where she gripped the stone. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her teeth gritted against the onslaught. He could see the violent trembling arch of her back, the sheer force of a body at war with itself. This wasn't a woman in trouble. This was a woman in labor. He was 10 yards away when the spasm passed. Her body went limp, her head falling forward, her dark hair fanning out in the current. She looked fragile enough to be swept away. "Hey!" he called out, his voice a rough, rusted thing. "Hey, you!" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and wild with fear and pain fixed on him. They were the color of a stormy sky. "Please!" She gasped the word, a puff of white in the cold air. "Help! The baby." He stood there, a statue carved from regret. He saw her, but his mind showed him another woman, his Sarah, her skin just as pale, her breath just as shallow in the lamplight of their cabin. He saw the helplessness, felt the icy grip of a failure so absolute it had hollowed him out. Who left you here? He demanded, the question sharp in accusation against the world. They couldn't, she stammered before another contraction hit her like a mule's kick. She cried out a high, thin sound that the wind snatched and carried away. There was no time. The ghosts in his head screamed at him to run, but the woman before him was real. Her pain was real, and the life she was fighting for was real. The decision wasn't a thought, it was an action. He plunged into the knee-deep water, the shock of the cold a welcome sting. It cleared his head. He reached her, his large hands finding purchase on her trembling arms. She felt impossibly light, yet carried the weight of the whole world. "I've got you." He grunted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" She shook her head, her eyes glassy. "It's coming." He didn't waste another breath. He scooped her up out of the river. It was a deadlift, a strain of muscle and will against the drag of her wet clothes and the dead weight of her exhaustion. Her head fell against his shoulder, her breathing a ragged, hot puff against his neck. The trek back to his cabin was a journey through hell. The ground was uneven, littered with loose shale and tangled roots that seemed to grab at his ankles. He could feel every tremor that racked her body, hear every pained whimper. Twice he had to stop and brace himself against a tree as a full contraction seized her, her fingers digging into his shoulder with surprising strength while he simply stood a living anchor in her storm of pain. He finally burst through the tree line and saw at his cabin a small, grim silhouette of smoke and rough-hewn logs. It had been his tomb. Now it had to be a sanctuary. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and laid her gently on his own crude bunk. The scent of pine wood smoke and old sorrow filled the small space. He slammed the door shut against the wind and the river and the past. But he knew as he turned to face the pale, gasping woman on his bed that he hadn't shut the storm out. He had just brought it inside. The cabin was a world of 4 log walls, a stone hearth, and the dense masculine scent of solitude. It was a space built for one man's grief, stark and unyielding. Now it was a crucible. The air, once still and heavy with silence, was electric with pain, thick with the ragged, desperate sounds of a life fighting its way into existence. Nash moved. The fire first. He threw on more wood, his motions jerky, too fast. The flames leaped, casting wild dancing shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more menacing. Water on to boil. He filled the heavy iron kettle, the familiar weight doing nothing to steady the tremor in his hands. He needed clean cloths, clean. Anything. He ripped a strip from one of his own spare shirts, the sound of tearing fabric unnaturally loud. He was a man of the woods, a man who knew how to set a bone and stitch a wound. But this was a different kind of alchemy, a sacred, terrifying magic he was not equipped for. This was women's work. This was a realm of soft hands and softer voices, not his, which were calloused from the axe and raw from disuse. He turned back to the bunk. She was watching him, her stormy eyes wide, tracking his frantic movements. In the flickering firelight, he could see the sheen of sweat on her skin, the way her knuckles were bone white where she gripped the rough wool blanket. "My name," she gasped, her voice a thread of sound between waves of pain. "It's Daisy." The name hung in the air, a small, fragile thing in the violent chaos. A piece of her, a piece of a world he had abandoned. Nash, he found himself saying the name, tasting like rust in his own mouth. He knelt by the bunk, his mind racing, trying to recall snippets of conversations, old wives' tales, anything. You need to breathe, Daisy. Like this. He took a long, slow breath, an absurd pantomime of calm. She tried to follow her breath, catching in a sob, as another contraction seized her, her back arching off the cot. She cried out a sound that was no longer a scream of surprise, but a deep, guttural roar of pure animal effort. And in that sound, Nash was lost. He saw the firelight glint on the sweat of her brow, and for a heart-stopping second it wasn't her face he saw, but Sarah's. His Sarah. Her eyes wide, not with the pain of birth, but with the hot, bewildered panic of the fever that was stealing her away. He saw his own hands, helpless then, as they were now. He remembered the silence after her last shallow breath, the same silence he'd been running from ever since. He recoiled from the bunk as if he'd been burned. The ghosts were here in his sanctuary, their icy fingers on his soul. He couldn't do this. He couldn't watch it again. He couldn't watch death win in this room a second time. I can't. He whispered the words swallowed by the roar of the fire. He was on his feet, backing away, his own breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. He was a coward, a fraud, a man who could face down a grizzly but not the memory of his own failure. Her voice cut through his terror. It was weak, but it was sharp as a shard of ice. Don't. He stopped, his back pressed against the rough logs of the wall. He looked at her. Daisy's eyes were open, locked on his. The pain was still there, a living thing twisting her features, but beneath it was something else. A flicker of fierce, unbending will. She was not asking for a healer or a hero. She was asking for a witness. She was asking him not to leave her alone in the dark. "Don't you leave me," she gasped, her voice gaining a thread of steel. You stay right here." It was not a plea, it was a command. And it broke the spell. The ghosts receded, pushed back by the raw, undeniable reality of the woman on the cot. She was not Sarah, she was Daisy, and she was not dying, she was fighting, and she was not alone. He moved back to her side, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was joined by something else now, a grim, hard resolve. He would not fail again. "All right, Daisy," he said, his voice low and steady now, a rock for her to hold on to. "All right. We do this together. When the pain comes, you push. You hear me? You push like you're pushing the whole world away." And so began the longest night of Nash Redwood's life. He was no longer a man haunted by his past, but a man anchored in a brutal, beautiful present. He was the voice in the dark, the steady hand, the keeper of the flame. He spoke to her, coached her, held her hand when she squeezed so hard he thought his bones would crack. He saw a strength in her he had never witnessed in any living thing, a force of nature that humbled him. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, to the flickering light, to the rhythm of her breathing, and the pounding of his own heart. Then came the final soul-shattering push, a cry that was a prayer, a moment of impossible suspended silence, and then a new sound, thin, wobbly, but utterly miraculously alive. A baby's cry filled the silence, a sound so potent it seemed to cleanse the very air, washing away the ghosts, the grief, the years of quiet despair. In the quiet that followed a quiet deeper than any wilderness, Nash, his hands slick with the miracle of it all, gently lifted the small, slippery, perfect life. A girl. He wrapped her in the cleanest thing he owned, a piece of his own shirt, and laid her on her mother's chest. Daisy was weeping silent tears of exhaustion and joy, tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She looked at Nash, her stormy eyes now as clear and calm as a dawn sky. He looked down at his own hands. They were shaking again, but not from fear. They were steady. They were capable. They were the hands of a man who had against all odds welcomed a life into the world, instead of watching one leave it. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a haven. And the silence was no longer empty. It was full. Dawn broke not with a triumphant fire, but with a soft, apologetic gray that filtered through the cabin's single grimy window pane. The world outside was hushed, blanketed in a profound stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the silence was of a different sort. It was not empty. It was filled with the tiny whisper-soft sounds of a new life, The rustle of a blanket, a sigh no bigger than a milkweed seed, the deep, even breathing of an exhausted mother finally surrendered to sleep. Nash had not slept. He had sat in his rickety chair by the hearth, the fire burned down to a bed of glowing, watchful embers, and he had listened. He was a guardian, a sentinel posted at the border of a new and terrifying world. His body ached with a weariness that went deeper than muscle and bone. It was the ache of a soul that had been stretched to its limit and had not, to his unending surprise, broken. He rose, his movements slow, deliberate, a mime of silence. He added a single dry log to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life without a sound. His old life, his routine of traps and solitude, had been consumed in the fire of the previous night. It was ash. His new purpose lay on the bunk, swaddled in his own shirt. He put a pot of water on to boil and shaved off slivers of the dried venison he kept hanging from the rafters. He would make a broth. It was what one did. He remembered that much. The memory surfaced without its usual escort of pain, presenting itself simply as a piece of useful information. His large, rough hands, so accustomed to the heft of an axe, felt clumsy and oversized as he worked. A soft sound came from the bunk. He turned. Daisy was awake, her eyes open. They were no longer wild with pain, but held a lucid, bottomless exhaustion. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze taking in the pot, the fire, the quiet diligence of his movements. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice husky. Nash didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the broth, stirring it with a wooden spoon. No water in the river, no fire. You wouldn't have made it through the night. It was a statement of fact, not a claim of heroism. He was uncomfortable with her gratitude. It implied a debt, and a debt was a tie to the world. "Thank you," she said, ignoring his deflection. The two words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of a sacrament. He just grunted in reply. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by a soft coo from the bundle beside Daisy. She shifted, wincing slightly, and looked down at the tiny face. "She's so small." "They usually are," Nash said, his voice still rough. He brought a cup of the steaming broth over to the bunk. "You need to drink this, for your strength." She took it, her hands trembling slightly. As she sipped, she looked from the baby to him. What should we call her? The question caught him off guard. We. The word felt like a brand. It bound him to this moment, to these two strangers who had washed up on the shore of his solitude. He looked at the tiny infant, her face wrinkled and serious in sleep. He looked at the gray light filtering through the window, the promise of a new day after a long, dark night. "Dawn," he said, the word coming out before he had a chance to stop it. Her name could be Dawn. Daisy tested the word on her tongue. "Dawn," she repeated softly, a faint, beautiful smile touching her lips for the first time. "I like that." She looked down at her daughter. "Hello, Dawn." The fragile days that followed were a quiet, intense blur of survival. Nash fell into a new rhythm, not of forgetting, but of remembering how to care. He hunted with a new urgency his quarry, not just for his own sustenance, but for hers. He learned the language of a newborn's cries. He found himself listening for the sound of Daisy's steady breathing as she slept, a reassurance that they had survived another night. One afternoon, while Daisy rested, the baby began to fuss. He hesitated, then, with a deep breath, he walked to the bunk and gently lifted the small bundle. The warmth of her, the sheer, terrifying fragility of her life in his massive hands, sent a jolt through him. She was a fistful of life, a concentration of impossible hope. He held her against his chest and began to walk the floor of the cabin, his heavy footsteps a stark contrast to the tiny precious weight in his arms. He hummed a low, tuneless sound from deep in his chest, the same sound he used to make for his Lily. The memory came sharp and clear, Lily with hair the color of corn silk, her head tucked under his chin. For a second the grief was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut. He thought he might drop the child. But then the baby Dawn made a small, contented sound and snuggled deeper into the crook of his arm. And the memory shifted. It was no longer just the hollow echo of loss. It was now coupled with this new, warm, living reality. The pain was still there, a scar on his soul, but it was no longer the only thing. Later that evening, as the fire crackled, painting their faces in orange and gold, Daisy watched him staring into the flames. "You're good with her," she said softly. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. He kept his eyes on the fire, but he spoke the words into the quiet of the cabin, exorcising a ghost. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice quiet, steady. "Her name was Lily." He felt Daisy's gaze on him, full of a sad, profound understanding. She didn't offer pity. She didn't say she was sorry. She simply let the name hang in the air between them, giving it space, giving it honor. He had shared his deepest wound. She had witnessed it without flinching. In that shared silence, the last of the walls around Nash's heart crumbled to dust. He looked from the fire to the woman and the child sleeping peacefully on the bunk. His cabin was no longer a fortress for his grief. It was a shelter. It was a home. And he was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man standing guard over a future. The seasons began their slow, inexorable turn. The harsh winds of early winter gave way to the deep, silent cold of its heart. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by a calendar, but by the infant's growth, by the dwindling pile of firewood, by the quiet rhythm of their shared existence. The cabin, once a monument to Nash's grief, had been transformed. It smelled now of milk and clean linen and the faint sweet scent of Daisy's humming. The silence was no longer an absence, but a presence, a soft, protective blanket woven from the sounds of a sleeping baby and the steady beat of 3 hearts. Nash found a peace in the routine that startled him. He would hunt, but his focus was different. He sought not just meat, but tender cuts for a nourishing broth. He repaired a leak in the roof, not because it bothered him, but because the thought of a cold draft touching the baby's crib, a cradle he had painstakingly carved from a fallen pine, was unbearable. He was a man remade by purpose. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily had not vanished, but they had retreated. They no longer stood at his shoulder accusing. They sat with him by the fire, their memory a quiet, sorrowful warmth rather than a chilling void. He was outside splitting logs with the steady, powerful swing of his axe when he saw it. A figure. A smudge of darkness against the vast, unforgiving white of the snow-covered plains moving steadily toward the cabin. His movements didn't slow, but a cold, sharp alertness coursed through him. This was not a wandering animal. Animals did not walk with such weary, determined purpose. His hand rested on the handle of the axe, his body a coiled spring. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude, screamed intruder. But a new instinct, fierce and primal, screamed protector. He left the axe buried in the chopping block and slipped inside the cabin, pulling his heavy rifle from its pegs above the door. The metallic click as he checked the chamber was the only sound. Daisy looked up from the hearth where she was stirring a pot of stew, a question in her eyes. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low, "and stay quiet." He stepped back out onto the small porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, and watched the figure resolve itself. It was a woman, stumbling occasionally, in the deep snow, her form thin and frail against the immense landscape. He raised the rifle slightly, a clear warning. "That's far enough," he boomed his voice, carrying across the frozen silence. The figure stopped raising a hand. Just then the cabin door creaked open behind him. Daisy stood there, her face pale, drawn by the commotion. She squinted her hand, shielding her eyes from the glare of the snow. A moment passed. Then a name, barely a whisper, escaped her lips. Martha. The woman in the snow collapsed to her knees, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The reunion was a tense, fragile thing held in the cramped warmth of the cabin. Martha Daisy's sister-in-law sat huddled by the fire, wrapped in one of Nash's blankets, sipping the hot stew he had silently ladled into a bowl for her. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by a journey fueled by something more potent than food or rest. Guilt. Nash stood by the window, his back to the room, the rifle now resting against the wall, but still within arm's reach. He was an observer to a scene not meant for him, an intruder in his own home. "I couldn't." Martha began, her voice cracking. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw you. By the river." She looked at Daisy, her gaze pleading. "Pa, he's not a bad man, Daisy. He's just broken. Since John died, he's been terrified. Of sickness, of winter, of not having enough. He thought we couldn't manage. It was a cruel thing, a weak, cruel thing. And I went along with it." Daisy said nothing. She just held Dawn closer to her chest, her expression unreadable. She was no longer the helpless, desperate woman Nash had pulled from the river. There was a new stillness in her, a quiet strength that was formidable. "I waited a week," Martha continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Then I told them I was going to my cousin's in the next county. I took what I could, and I came to find you. I followed the river for days. I'm so sorry, Daisy. Forgive me." A long silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the baby. Nash felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He wanted to tell this woman to leave, to take her apologies and her weakness, and disappear back into the world that had cast Daisy out. He had built a sanctuary here, a fragile peace, and she was a threat to it. "There's nothing to forgive," Daisy said finally, her voice clear and calm. It held no warmth, but no anger either. It was the voice of a judge delivering a verdict that was already known. "What's done is done." Martha seemed to shrink into herself. Then she leaned forward, her eyes bright with a desperate hope. "Then come home," she said, her voice urgent. "Come back with me. We have the room ready. Pa is sorry, he is. We'll take care of you. We'll take care of the baby. You shouldn't be out here. It's no place to raise a child." The word struck Nash like a physical blow. Come home. He felt the air leave his lungs. Of course. This was the natural order of things. He was just a temporary harbor in a storm. He was the stranger, the rescuer, whose part in the story was now over. He looked at Daisy, expecting to see relief in her eyes, a yearning for the comfort of family, for the world she had known. But he saw only a deep, thoughtful stillness. She was looking at Dawn, her expression tender. Then her gaze drifted around the small, rough cabin. She looked at the cradle he had built, at the fire he kept burning, at the stack of furs he had gathered. She was weighing two worlds. And in that moment, Nash felt the familiar icy grip of his old solitude returning. He felt the walls of the cabin closing in, pushing him out. He turned his full attention to the window, staring out at the endless empty white, his knuckles white where he gripped the sill. He was already preparing himself for the silence that would follow their departure. The silence he knew so well. He was already saying goodbye. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, a fourth presence in the room. It was stretched taut between Martha's desperate plea, Daisy's unreadable stillness, and the rigid line of Nash's back as he stared out the window. He watched a lone hawk circle in the vast, indifferent sky and felt a kinship with it. Alone, self-sufficient, unseen. He had worked for years to achieve that state, and now the thought of returning to it felt like a death sentence. He felt rather than saw Daisy shift on the bunk. The soft weight of her gaze was on him. He could not turn. To turn would be to reveal the chasm of fear that had just opened in his soul. He was a temporary man, a means to an end, a bridge she had to cross to get back to her own kind. Martha, mistaking Daisy's silence for hesitation, pressed on her voice earnest and pleading. It's a hard life out here, Daisy. You know it is. A child needs more than this, more than just one man and four walls. She needs a family, a town. She needs to hear other children laugh. Martha's eyes shone with tears. Pa will come around. He was just lost in his own grief. But your boy, he's John's son. He's our blood. We can make it right. Our blood. The words were a hammer blow to Nash's fragile peace. Blood. It was the one thing he could not offer. He was an outsider, a ghost. He pushed himself away from the window and walked to the wall, taking his rifle down from its pegs. The worn wood and cool steel were familiar in his hands. He found a clean rag and a bottle of oil and began the slow, methodical process of cleaning the weapon. It was a task that required no thought and anchor in the sudden violent storm of his feelings. His movements were precise, controlled. They were a lie. Inside his world was splintering. He cleaned the rifle because it was what a man alone did. He was preparing the cabin to be a tomb again. She's a girl. Daisy's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the clarity of a struck bell. Nash's hand stilled on the rifle barrel. He heard the rustle of the blanket as she shifted Dawn in her arms. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Daisy was not looking at her sister-in-law. She was looking at him. At his back. Her name is Dawn Daisy, continued her voice, gaining a quiet, formidable strength. And family isn't just blood, Martha. Nash slowly, deliberately placed the rifle on the table. He turned, leaning against the log wall, his arms crossed, a spectator at his own fate. Daisy finally turned her gaze to Martha, but her words felt as if they were meant for the silent man by the wall. Family is who runs into a freezing river for a stranger. Family is who stays up all night terrified to help bring a child into the world, even when it tears his own scars open. Her eyes flickered to Nash for a bare second, a glance so full of meaning it made his throat tighten. Family, she said, her voice softening as she looked down at the sleeping infant as who builds a cradle with his own two hands, because he knows a baby needs a safe place to dream. She looked up again, her gaze direct and unpoved. You say this is no place to raise a child. I think there is no better place. Here she won't learn about shame or fear or what happens when people get thrown away because they're inconvenient. Here she'll learn what strength looks like. She'll learn what kindness is. Real kindness. The kind that doesn't run when the winter comes. The finality in her voice was absolute. She looked at her sister-in-law, her expression now softened with a sad pity. My home is here now, Martha. The words landed. Nash watched as the hope drained from Martha's face, replaced by a weary, sorrowful acceptance. She saw it too. She saw the invisible, unbreakable threads that now bound the three people in this room. This was not a rescue. This was a realignment of the stars. I see, Martha whispered. She stood, her movements stiff. She walked to the door and picked up the satchel of supplies she had brought. She placed it on the small table. For the baby. She paused her hand on the door latch and looked at Daisy one last time. You be safe then. You be happy. And then she was gone. The door closed, leaving behind the scent of the cold outside and the heavy weight of a choice that had just changed everything. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't the silence of tension or of grief. It was the silence of a held breath being released. Nash pushed himself off the wall. He did not know what to do with his hands, with his heart, which was pounding a slow, heavy, hopeful rhythm. He walked to the hearth, not as a stranger, but as a man in his own home. He reached down and laid a hand on the edge of the small wooden cradle. His fingers traced the smooth, carved pine. He felt Daisy's presence beside him. She's smiling in her sleep, Daisy said softly. Nash looked down at the tiny, perfect face of the baby girl named Dawn. A small, involuntary smile touched his own lips, the first true smile in years. It felt like a sunrise. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I see that." The days that followed Martha's departure settled into a new kind of quiet. It was not the hollow silence of a forgotten place, but the soft, breathing quiet of a home. The cabin, which had been Nash's armor against the world, became a vessel for their new life. It held the scent of boiling milk, the warmth of a constantly tended fire, and the faint, sweet smell of a sleeping baby. It held them. Nash found that the rhythm of his life had shifted in a way that was both profound and startlingly simple. His hands, which had only ever taken from the wilderness game woodstone, were now constantly giving. He would return from the trapline not with the grim satisfaction of a survivor, but with the quiet pride of a provider. He'd enter the cabin, and his gaze would immediately seek them out, Daisy by the fire, her head bent as she stitched a tiny garment, and Dawn, a small, perfect miracle in the cradle he had made. One evening he came in from the biting cold, a heavy rabbit dangling from his fist. He hung it by the door and walked to the fire, warming his hands. Daisy looked up, a soft smile on her face. "It's a cold one tonight," she said, her voice a gentle melody against the wind howling outside. "The wind's angry," he agreed, his eyes finding the cradle. "But we're safe enough in here." The word was no longer a stranger. It was a log on the fire, a roof over their heads. It was the foundation of this new world he had never intended to build. He had kept the softest pelt from his last catch, a snowshoe hare, with fur as white and fine as spun cloud. He had worked it until it was supple, and now he walked over and laid it gently in the cradle, tucking it around the sleeping baby. Daisy watched him, her eyes shining in the firelight. She said nothing, but her look held a universe of gratitude. Later, when the stew was eaten and the only light came from the dancing flames, they sat in a comfortable silence. The ghosts of his past were still there, he knew, but they were no longer howling at the door. They were distant stars, faint and far, their sorrow outshone by the warmth of the hearth. Daisy's gaze was on the rough-hewn logs of the wall. "This is a good, strong cabin," she said softly. Nash looked around the small space. It had been his refuge, his prison. Now, seeing it through her eyes, he saw it for what it was. A start. "It'll hold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It'll hold through this winter. And the next one." Daisy turned to him, and he saw the glint of tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "It's a good place," she whispered, "to watch a child grow." He knew then. The last wall of his fear, the final stone of his solitude, crumbled away. He was not just a rescuer. He was not just a guardian. He was home. He rose and walked to the cradle, looking down at the daughter who was not his by blood, but who was his by every choice that mattered. He placed a hand on the sturdy pine frame, his touch full of a future he had never dared to imagine. He looked at Daisy, a real smile finally reaching his eyes. "Come spring," he said, his voice steady and sure, "we can add on. A bigger window, maybe, for her to see the river." And in that moment, under the quiet gaze of the woman he had saved and who had saved him, in turn Nash Redwood was no longer alone. The river still flowed, the wind still blew, but the long, empty silence of his life had been filled. It was filled with the crackle of a fire, the soft hum of a lullaby, and the promise of dawn.